Hey everybody, welcome back. We'll get things kicked off here in just a minute. Happy Friday to everybody. Logan, welcome. Shane, welcome. Sydney, good day. Meredith, hello. So if you recall, today's format's going to be a little bit different than some of our previous webinars. Normally we have a deck accompanied by some data, some stats, and other fun things we've collected throughout the last 2 weeks. Today is going to be very much a watch me work session, meaning you're actually going to see how I use content, context, audience, and reach, and the 4A's framework to build guesting campaigns from scratch. So, if you've attended either of our two previous webinars immediately preceding this one, if you'll recall, the first one that we started out with was the State of Podcast Guest Pitching Report, 2026 edition. In that webinar, we unveiled and then unpacked the survey results. We talked to 25 different individuals that either are podcast hosts, podcast producers, or run podcast production agencies. We asked them 4 questions. Best pitch they've ever received, worst pitch they've ever received. What's one thing that they wish guest pitchers knew before they ever reached out? And then what was their acceptance rate versus response rate to pitches that they receive? So a lot of illuminating data as part of that. And the extension off of that, especially in light of some of the statistics that we saw, i.e. a median response rate of about 5%, or yes rate of about 5%. How do we increase our numbers? How do we beat benchmarks established by the guest pitching report that we had put together? And that's when we had 2 weeks ago a reintroduction, if you will, to the concepts of content, context, audience, and reach for finding the right shows to pitch, and then the 4A's framework, which is going to be very helpful for podcast guest pitching. Now, a lot of that is kind of academic, a little bit in the weeds, so to say, when it comes to strategy and that sort of thing. But today we're going to be very tactical. So again, there won't be a deck that's part of this, but of course the session will be recorded so you can play it back at your leisure. I'll try to pull a transcript for the webinar as well, so you can use it as an accompaniment to the replay that'll come up too. So again, without further ado, we will hop right into this. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. I'm going to try a little bit different format where the background's actually going to be over my shoulder or side by side. Let's do side by side. There we go. All right. Cool. Can I just get a quick thumbs up in the chat? You can see my screen. Don't be shy. Looks good. Thanks, John. Thanks, Talia. Thanks, Meredith. All right, cool. So again, we wanted to make this as real world applicable as possible, and I promise it'd be a real campaign with a real client and that sort of thing. So this is actually a campaign that we've been asked to contribute to or work on directly with our parent company, Acast. For those that don't know, Acast bought us about 4 years ago. They're the largest open podcast ecosystem company in the podcast landscape today. They host about 150,000 podcasts globally. And they have some very unique and very talented podcasters that are part of their network. And if you're familiar with Giggly Squad, The Athletic, these are going to be some of the shows that Acast represents and has monetization rights for. So, in addition to that, again, this is going to be just context. Acast has what's called a self-serve platform. So rather than going through a sales representative to set up a podcast advertising campaign, you can actually book sponsorships, endorsements directly through Acast self-serve portal. So I'm mentioning all this as context because for this campaign, our job is to position Pat Butkus, who's the SVP of Marketing and Growth at Acast, who also oversees all of the self-serve initiatives. Our goal is to book Pat on relevant podcasts that are hitting their target audience. And this is the document that was sent over. You could really view this as like a briefing document, if you will. And this was put together by the team over at Acast. So my screen is very small. Okay, well, I'll try to zoom in a little bit. Here we'll go a couple pluses there. So again, if you don't get a briefing document like this from your client, or if you're not presenting a briefing document to your client, I think that's probably a very good first step, especially if your clients aren't totally aware of podcasts or they're just dipping their toe into the waters for the first time, or even if you've done this a while. I like to have this as like a reference point or an artifact that I can take with me into the campaign as we begin kind of what we'll call this pre-planning process, right? So again, overview, I already gave you some of this, but represent Acast and our ad platform with appearances on marketing podcasts that align with our best target audience, showing the benefits of the podcast marketing and how easily it can be set up. So great. Again, if you're familiar with how we've run some of these webinars before, we always like to start with understanding what our client's goals are. So in this case, our client is going to be Acast, which is actually our parent company, but follow the bouncing ball with me. The objectives that they have or the goals that they have for this campaign is to generate leads into the ad platform through a deep dive into podcast advertising's benefits and a guide of best practices in running successful campaigns. So I'll pause there real quick because, again, I want to make sure that we're viewing this all through the backdrop or context of the two frameworks we've discussed at length: content, context, audience, and reach, and then the 4A's framework. So starting with content, context, audience, and reach, if I'm thinking about that, um, I'm thinking about content. So what kind of shows are going to align with our guests' areas of interest or expertise? Context, what kind of show, what kind of perspective do these shows have on said content? Audience, again, we want to make sure that's representative of the people that can actually make purchasing decisions in this case. And then finally, reach. So we've always described reach as kind of like a spectrum. So on one side of the spectrum, you're going to have these mass media, pop culture type shows. They're going to go a mile wide in terms of the topics they cover, but not very deep. Usually those are hosted by celebrities, influencers, otherwise notable people. And then the other side of the spectrum, on the reach spectrum, you're going to have more of these niche types of shows. They'll go really deep in terms of subject matter expertise, but their reach isn't going to be nearly as high because, again, they've purposely decided to niche down on their content and build a community around that content that's going to serve them. So that'll be a lot more like peer related and that sort of thing. So again, as we're stepping through this briefing document, I'm always thinking about content, context, audience, and reach. And even within the objectives in the overview already, so we're not even a quarter way through the page yet. When I'm thinking about this content, I'm thinking about marketing. Now, obviously, content or marketing in and of itself is going to be too broad of a term because if we threw marketing into a Podchaser search, we're going to get thousands of results and they're not all going to be relevant. So I know a little bit more about the podcast advertising world than maybe anybody else on the call right now because this is primarily a PR and comms audience. So I know some of the intricacies. But if I didn't, what I would first start to do is gather some of the materials that the client has given me, parse through them, and we'll show you exactly how to do that here in a minute. And then start building out like this keyword cloud, if you will. So we know that Pat is the SVP of marketing and growth. We know that they want to reach marketers. There's going to be some derivatives. They're going to be very important. But again, I just want to emphasize this point. If you've got CCAR or CCAR, as our client success team likes to call it, and you can make the parrot noise if you'd like. But if you have that kind of, embering in the back of your head, I think it's going to help as you approach even a brief like this. So again, the objectives, ad platform, deep dive into podcast advertising's benefit. Now here they're going to talk a little bit more about some of the measurements that they're going to use to indicate whether this campaign was a success or not. So the first would be self-serve signups, referencing the specific podcast as a source. We can do a whole another webinar, and in fact, we probably will do a webinar about this if you want to level up some of your reporting, specifically from an earned media perspective. So obviously website traffic is going to be one of those things. Hand raisers with high intent leads on your website is going to be another. But again, that's going to be another webinar for another day. Incremental increase in self-serve signups during the show period. And then the big question is, are we going to offer some sort of promo to listeners? So, okay, or from a content perspective, we want to be in the marketing space. We know we want to be in the podcast advertising space. We know that there's going to be some derivatives, which we're going to further unpack. Now, this part here starts to get into a little bit more of the meat and potatoes of it, right? So we want to educate advertisers on how podcast advertising can deliver on your business goals, how it suits performance marketers, including pixel tracking. So again, we talked about some of the derivatives. Now we've gone from that top layer of marketing content to all of a sudden we want to be in front of performance marketers. So that's going to add another keyword to our list. So performance marketers, performance marketing. You can even think about, well, where do we find more performance marketers in from an industrial perspective? And there's going to be a lot more performance marketers in the direct to consumer world. So now I'm thinking about e-commerce podcasts, I'm thinking about D2C podcasts, and all of a sudden, in my head anyway, I start to think about all of these different things and categorizing and bucketing each of them in my head. Now, again, that's a lot. I've done this at least a few times, but what I would suggest is definitely writing it down, and we'll do that here in a minute. Um, Educate advertisers on how sponsorship campaigns elevate trust, how it's easily manageable through a self-serve platform like Acast. Okay, great. So now we understand some of the metrics, we understand some of the goals. Now we can kind of proceed here. So this is really going to start to get into some of the talk tracks or some of the questions we might want to lace into the pitches that we ultimately send after we've identified best fit shows. So, a couple of things. Because Acast is running advertising campaigns for their self-serve podcast advertising platform, they're running a lot of podcast ads. And naturally, they have the benefit of that because as a podcast platform, they have in-house inventory that they can use. And one of their ad units that they use to promote their self-serve platform is actually putting ads on their own podcast. And again, with 150,000 at their disposal, they can run a lot of ads basically for almost no cost outside of the opportunity cost of having a potential other advertiser fill in that open inventory, right? So, okay, that's a kind of interesting meta point. So, again, as I'm thinking about setting this campaign up, one of the very cool things that I can probably weave into this narrative is that Acast self-serve platform's number one lead driver is actually podcast advertising. Now that fits very, very well. I've already discussed with you just now about some of the kind of inside baseball about how that works. So maybe I want to lead with that, but now that I'm thinking it through, I don't want to open up Pat in a discussion to leading with a very strong statement saying podcast advertising is the number one source of deals for us, a podcast advertising platform. A discerning host or a discerning producer will look at that and say, yeah, wait a minute, you're playing with house money. Of course that's going to be true. So while that seemed like a really good idea, a really good angle to approach this from a content perspective and even from a context perspective, as I'm thinking about context further, I want to make sure that I'm not opening up my guest, Pat Butkus, to any sort of gotcha questions, right? Or put him in an uncomfortable position in the middle of an interview where he now has to defend, oh no, it's fine that we use in-house advertising to accomplish a lot of our goals. So again, this is somewhat you sing into my brain, which can be a scary thought at times as our team will attest, but I want to give you like the real stream of consciousness about this. However, if we look at the next bullet point, this one becomes very significant for us. So podcast campaigns can deliver 4.9x average long-term ROAS, and this is according to a study conducted by Acast and OMD, which is a large holding company advertising agency. So again, we'll get into how we gather some of the materials for all of these campaigns on the back half of this, but I just wanted to show you that we do have a performance marketing playbook. This is the one that's referenced in the document, and as you can see, it's chock full of data and statistics, which again, we're going to want to leverage from the pitch perspective as well as the guest preparation perspective. And also as we're thinking about when an episode actually does go live and it does get clipped for social media, et cetera, having a really strong kind of standout statistic like this would look awesome on an Instagram reel or a TikTok or a YouTube short, right? So again, we're really thinking about this at every stage of the guest booking journey, not just the show selection, not just the pitch itself, not just the guest interview, but also how it gets distributed post haste. And then finally, smaller shows have a 35% increase in median visit rate and 14% increase in media purchase rate. And that's through a third party, which is called Podscribe, and they're a pixel attribution provider in our world. I'm going to skip that one just because it's not an owned asset in the Acast content ecosystem. It is referenced from a third party. So, if we don't have an owned reference with that sort of thing, we could obviously pull that. But for the purposes of impact and making good on the objectives that have been laid out here from our client, we don't want to send referral traffic to a third party. We want to keep it primarily close to the vest with Acast owned content, right? So again, that's how I want to start thinking about these things as I'm setting up campaigns. So these loosely correlate bullet point to bullet point, but these are going to be some additional pieces of information, and you already see this call out here. It's how, right? And I'm skipping a little bit ahead to the 4A's framework. And 4A's again are going to be analytical, aspirational, anthropological, and when we think about like the how, it's going to be actionable. Sorry, that was the fourth one. Any question that answers how is going to be actionable, and sometimes it's also going to bleed over into anthropological or analytical. So when we see how, that should raise a flag in our head saying, "Ooh, I want to keep a mental note of this." And then let me think about how I can weave that into the 4A's. And it's not just from the pitch perspective, but also from the show alignments perspective as we build out our target list. So this is going to be an interesting one. Smaller shows can drive more efficient leads with less competition, more high intent listens that can be a perfect for performance oriented marketers. Okay. So again, think back a couple stanzas above here, right? We talked about performance marketing being a derivative of an overarching marketing content pillar, if you will. Well, if I'm going to pitch a more performance marketing oriented show, I can basically start writing this pitch in my head, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. So if advertisers or brands are hesitant to enter into podcasts for the first time, new data from Acast reveals that smaller shows actually drive more efficient leads because they have high intent listens and less competition. Most of podcast advertisers, and I think the statistics somewhere, and I don't have it readily available, but almost like 90% of podcast advertising dollars get spent on the top 5,000 shows, right? So if you don't want to dump all of your podcast advertising budget into a very noisy, a very crowded kind of ad unit, especially with those top shows, there's gold in them there hills, there's riches in the niches, and I can use that as a potential bullet point within the pitch that I'm going to send later on. There it is. 44% of podcast ad investment lands in the top 500 shows, which is 12% of podcasting's monthly reach. So these two really tie back together. 60% of listeners believe niche shows are more engaging, and 63% are less likely to skip ads. 57% more attention, pay more attention to the ads. Okay, so as you can see, all of these bullet points do coincide with the smaller show side. And before we had mentioned that Podscribe is a third party content originator, what we can see now is Podcast Pulse, which is actually going to be an Acast owned media property. And let me see if I've got it up here. I do believe I do. Yeah. So you can see in the Podcast Pulse report, which is an Acast owned piece of content, we can reference this directly. And while we do know that some of the outcomes that we're seeking or the objectives that we're trying to hit are going to be self-serve signups and then driving traffic to it. One of the great things that I think podcast guesting can do is not have to give a hard sale, right? So this in and of itself, and I know we're talking about performance marketing and direct response in some ways as we talk through this, but an earned media appearance isn't necessarily always going to tie back to cash registers ringing. So if you do have an annual report or a chunky piece of content that's information rich, analytically driven, that can often serve as a really good CTA for your podcast guest appearance or your client's guest appearance. And it doesn't feel salesy. So instead of saying, by the end of the interview, you've got your client on and they're promoting the thing that they've come to loosely um, promote. Instead of saying, yeah, go to my website and get 10% off your first purchase of the product that I built. If you actually leave them with a CTA that is more content oriented, it's going to accomplish a couple of different things. One, it doesn't feel quite as salesy. Two, it's elongating in a good way the kind of like pipeline, if you will. So if we were to drive listeners to downloading the podcast Pulse report, obviously they're going to be able to see all of this data that Pat referenced in the podcast guest appearance further in their own eyes. And then they're also on the back end, as soon as they download the report, they're going to be entered into like an MQL funnel from the ACAST side, and they'll be nurtured throughout a campaign. And it might lead to direct outreach from a sales representative at some point, or in this case, getting them to build enough trust with ACAST as a podcast platform where they do set up their first campaign. So, again, sometimes, and this is going to have to go back to what your client's goals are, if they don't need to necessarily be as sales driven, giving them value, providing the audience value through an additional piece of content that's referenced throughout the guest interview is a really effective means. And oftentimes, I can just speak from experience when we used to run Podchaser Connect, our guest booking agency, which has since been acquired, of course. We looked at this quite a bit, and when it came to how clients were thinking about what their CTAs or their calls to action should be in some of these guest appearances, oftentimes what they were doing was judging how much money they were spending on LinkedIn ads to promote a piece of thought leadership, and then comparing it to how many content downloads they were getting from a podcast guest appearance. And I can think of at least three clients that had a better quote unquote return on ad spend by doing it through the podcast guest appearance format, as opposed to just paying LinkedIn to serve that content directly to their audiences. So again, something that you didn't necessarily ask for as part of this, but when I like to start these campaigns, I like to think through things from not just the start, but all the way through the end, because ultimately that's how we're gonna be judged. Okay, so by looking at this, obviously we've got this initial brief. There are a few call outs, right? So content, context, audience, and reach, of course, are the things we're looking for. We've already established content. We've already established context. Audience, we've established performance marketers, brand marketers, marketers, generally speaking. Reach, we don't necessarily have any sort of call out from the client on what their reach goals are. However, knowing that Pat is the SVP of growth and strategy, and knowing that I have at least two meetings with Pat on a weekly basis, and knowing that his calendar is extremely full, I want to make the executive decision from my end that if we do put Pat in front of a podcast opportunity, it's going to be worth his time, right? So, well, again, there's not this explicit reach requirement. If we're thinking about it from like what's going to maximize Pat's return on time invested, let's also play this back into the content, context, audience, and reach. So if we were looking at the one side of the spectrum, like what is the biggest marketing show that we could possibly get Pat on? It's probably going to talk about marketing in a very high level sense. It might have some interesting stories that they're pulling through with guests. It might reveal some data, that sort of thing. But you're going to get a very loose and a very wide margin of people that are actually listening to that podcast. Whereas if we were reaching out to a show that maybe only had 5,000 monthly listens or only got 1,200 listens per episode, but it was almost 100% dedicated to performance marketers, well, which audience is going to be the better return on investment for Pat? And especially knowing that the other marketing motions that they have in play to drive traffic and drive leads to their self-serve platform are coming through paid advertising, are coming through the podcast ads that we already know that they're running. Well, it's very difficult to target that specific of a niche with paid advertising. So, as a kind of a heuristic jump that we'll take is, well, if we can deliver this exact target audience, performance marketers that Pat and his team want to reach, we shouldn't be as concerned about reach, capital R reach, as the content and the context and the audience. So, again, I've sat in your seat. I know exactly how it feels when a client says, "Hey, can you get me on Joe Rogan? Can you get me on The Daily? Can you get me on NPR?" 100%. Love those questions. Love those the enthusiasm that most clients bring to it. However, are we chasing reach or are we chasing impact? And again, this is why having a briefing document or having an objectives kind of goal setting map like this is really important because it's going to enable you to start making better decisions. So they did take the ACAST did take the liberty of building a target show list based off of some of the things that they were seeing through our data and some of their own. And what we can see is their top priority is performance and brand marketers. Now, that's going to be the audience type. If you attended last week's webinar, we talked a little bit about using an exact phrase match search to find shows that are talking directly to these types of audiences. So oftentimes when people use an exact phrase match search, they're only looking at the podcast title. However, most podcasts, all podcasts are going to have a description. And if in that description, the podcast says this is the podcast for performance marketers doing X, Y, and Z, well, if it's specifically calling out performance marketers, you're going to take a very educated guess in that the people that are listening to the podcast are indeed performance marketers. Otherwise, why else would they listen? Sure, you might have a small percentage of folks that want to get into performance marketing and they're trying to level up their skills so they can take that leap from brand marketing to performance marketing, whatever. But it's going to be a fairly non-scientific, but also a highly reasoned approach. So if I were to pop into Podchaser Pro, which I can actually do here now, and I were to put in performance marketing, that's going to pull up, again, episodes that have mentioned performance marketing in the episode title, episode description, or the transcript, and then also podcasts. So we can click in any one of these, but if we were looking more so from an audience targeting perspective, I would put in performance marketers. And again, it's going to be a subtle difference, but we can see again that there's going to be podcasts that have that in the title or description, and there's going to be episodes that have that mentioned throughout as well. So in any case, that is one way to start thinking about this. So testing in the future, so broad marketers, right? We've discussed that. Maybe if we want to go with the highest reach type of marketing show, there's gonna be a lot more competition for those types of shows as well. Maybe that's something we'll save for a future date. So at least for this campaign, I'm more laser focused on performance and brand marketers. And then they also listed some show characteristics. So technical advice for hands-on marketers. And then they give some examples here: perpetual traffic, D2C podcast, digital marketing podcast, etc. I understand that most of our clients, if you are US domestic based, you're going to be primarily looking at a US audience. Again, ACAST is a global company. But what we can see is most of these markets that they're identifying are going to be English language podcasts. So that's one thing we don't want to put Pat in front of a Spanish speaking audience, for example. So from a context and from an audience perspective, we can feel pretty confident that we're going to reach the right folks. All right, so that is a quick run through. Now, this is another thing that I wanted to talk about. We see this come through in onboarding forms that we receive from our clients that are taking advantage of our list making abilities or capabilities. And oftentimes, as part of that onboarding form, we ask for a client bio. We also ask for who they want to be in front of, some questions they might want to be asked, what kind of impact they want to have on the show and the audience as well. But starting with the guest bio, oftentimes it's going to look kind of like this, a wall of text. So Pat's the SVP of Growth and Marketing at Acast, world's leading independent podcast company. He leads global marketing organization across brand performance, product insights, events, sales enablement, cross-functional growth, blah, 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 right? Sometimes the better use of your time is not filtering through a long corporate CV like this, and instead looking to see what kind of content already exists within the Acast ecosystem that you know, or that in your client's content ecosystem that you know is going to be relevant, or you know your client actually contributed to. And for this, there's going to be a couple of things, and this is going to kind of parlay us into some of the 4A's framework things as well. But while this is all great, what we want to start to do is bundling up all of the different assets that we can promote as part of this whole initiative, right? So there are a few things that I'll point to. So the first is going to be the sports podcast game plan. And this is top of mind right now, obviously, because we just came out of the Winter Olympics. There's a lot of advertiser interest in getting in front of highly engaged audiences, especially if they have interest in a certain category or certain topic and that sort of thing. So this is a kind of a comprehensive plan that Acast has put together that talks about all of the very interesting stats about engagement rates, the reach of people that listen to sports podcasts. Like this is an interesting one. Three times more Americans listen to sports podcasts and watched last year's NBA Finals. Wow, I didn't know that. If I put that in front of a sports marketing podcast or sports advertising podcast, that might raise an eyebrow or raise a question. And when we think about what makes for a good guest appearance, sometimes it is the unexpected, right? We think about the NBA Finals; it's the preeminent, the pinnacle, basically, of professional basketball. Yet, when we think about that, not as many people are tuning into that as there are people listening to sports podcasts. So that could make for some very interesting fodder in a podcast guest interview format. It would make for even better amplification of that content if it got clipped for social media, right? So again, this would be an interesting one, especially because the nice thing about this podcast, sports podcast game plan, is it breaks each of like the major sporting events into a quarter by quarter basis. So again, we're not in control of podcast production cycles. Oftentimes you'll sit down, let's say today's February 27th, you'll record an interview. That interview won't go live until March 27th, April 27th, May 27th. The age-old example that I give is we were working with a client in the higher ed space, and one of their professors was interviewed in December of 2023, and that episode didn't go live until January of 2025. Not January 2024, but January of 2025. So there was almost a full calendar year and then some between when the episode was recorded versus when it went live. So you got to think about these things in the back of your head. And one of the things I always recommend to clients is think about a quarter in advance. So right now, as we're looking at February, end of February, early March, if you're promoting or your client's trying to promote something that's spring break related or spring break oriented, whether they're doing travel, destination, tourism, that sort of thing, you're probably going to miss the spring break window. But if you bump that out to what we'll call the grads and dads kind of tentpole moment in the calendar, that might be actually very much aligned with a podcast production cycle. So we would think about dads and grads, dads being obviously Father's Day content, grads being people that are graduating from high school, college. Maybe again, if we're sticking with that tourism or travel theme that I just mentioned, hey, book your weekend round of golf with dad in our wonderful five-star resort and destination. We've got two links courses designed by Jack Nicholas, whatever, right? So again, I think that's an interesting one, but that's just one example of content we can pull from that Pat can actually speak to because he was part of the creation of this piece of content. The second one is the podcast pulse. So again, we've already talked about this a little bit. But what we can see here is a couple different things. So Again, in the objectives piece of the campaign brief that we received, while it didn't necessarily say this explicitly, the implied stance was that a lot of people have heard about podcast advertising. If they listen to podcasts, they've obviously heard podcast sponsorships and advertisement, but they might have some preconceived notions about what a podcast ad is and what it isn't. They might have some preconceived notions about the effectiveness of podcast advertising. So we can pull on some threads that are presented in this report specifically about how podcasters specifically are actually influencers, right? So, hey, as you're thinking about your budget and your performance marketing budget for 2026 and beyond, what would happen if you moved some of your dollars from your performance marketing with influencers into podcasts? So podcasts have generally had the lowest piece of the overall budget pie. But if we actually rewrite that narrative and say that they're actually influencer marketing, well, we should be tapping into our influencer marketing budget as it pertains to podcasts. And where are you going to do that? Again, if Pat does his job in the actual guest interview, you're going to dump some of that money into Acast self-serve platform, right? So again, these are going to be some interesting data points we can pull through. So podcasting has the best of both worlds, massive reach with captivating storytelling. This gets really interesting, especially as we're attacking some of these preconceived notions. So percentage of people who are focused when consuming the media type, audio podcast 70%. Well, if we're talking to an audience that has done a lot of meta ads, so Facebook, Instagram, etc., we can say, hey, obviously you're very comfortable with the devil you know in meta advertising. However, there's a advertising channel that exists out there that has an even higher percentage of focused consumers, and that is podcasts, right? So then we can leverage some of these data points in the pitch itself and Pat's guest appearance as well. Um, Third will be another piece of content, and this is Acast Ads Academy. So Pat and his team put together this learning platform basically, and you can actually get certified at the end of it. So one thing that I know about performance marketers is almost all of them are Meta Ads certified or Google Ads certified. It becomes like a badge of honor and oftentimes table stakes for them as they even approach new opportunities, new jobs, that sort of thing. Well, there's not a lot of podcast advertising uh, badged types of initiatives that exist out there. So Acast saw that gap in the marketplace. And as we think about an advertiser that isn't necessarily spending on podcasts yet, and we want them to approach the medium with a higher level of higher degree of confidence, go ahead and go get certified. We'll teach you the ins and the outs of what podcast advertising is and isn't. We'll walk you through campaign setups, what you should look out for, how to set yourself up for success, so on and so forth. So, again, this could be another thing that Pat could bring to a conversation, especially with podcasts that we've identified as having a more junior level audience or even seasoned audiences that are again primarily dumping their advertising budgets into channels other than podcasts. So don't want to belabor this point, but again, this is going to be how we're going to gather a lot of the content here and start to inform both our content context audience and reach selection for show selection, and then our forays framework as well. So going back to the doc real quick, I'm going to look at one of these shows. So again, we had a short list that was presented to us from Acast, but we also went out and did some research on our own. So one of the shows is going to be the D2C podcast. Content, is this going to be a fit for Pat's guest appearance? Content, we know that they're talking about direct to consumer businesses. We know that they're doing it primarily through a marketing or advertising lens. Context, this is where it gets the rubber meets the road a little bit. So I know the D2C podcast, we've worked with them before. I know that it's a podcast that's run by an agency called Pilot House. Pilot House does a lot of performance marketing campaigns on behalf of their clients. They've stood up this podcast as a means of educating their clients and prospective clients about how they approach direct to consumer marketing. So, from a context perspective, that's important because what I know is if it's an agency that's actually doing this podcast as a form of lead gen or brand building, They're not doing it for free. They're not doing it necessarily for just S's and G's, as the kids say. There might be some sort of remuneration that they'll seek. And I know for a fact that this podcast does sometimes require a guest fee when the guest is going to be explicitly promoting their product, their service, their software, etc. So contextually, this is a little bit of a maybe because it could put us in a position where this wouldn't be simply an earned media opportunity. It would be a paid media opportunity. But we would have to assess that with the podcast and maybe offer Pilot House, the company that runs this podcast, some sort of incentive to get more of their clients on. So this actually could be a much bigger win than we think about. But again, from a context perspective, this is how I start to think through these things. And again, one of the reasons why I know that this is run by Pilot House is within their actual podcast description. It says this is a podcast run by Pilot House, a performance marketing agency serving direct consumer customers. So again, you'd be able to see that directly in the podcast description within Podchaser Pro. From an audience perspective, again, if it's a D2C podcast, people are that are going to be listening are going to be direct consumer businesses that could be inclusive of ownership, leadership, marketers, operations, creatives, so on and so forth. So it's within the ballpark, I would say, from an audience perspective. But knowing that, again, this is run by a performance marketing agency, it's going to tilt a little bit more towards the marketer side, which is great for us because that's exactly the target audience we want to hit. Now, from the reach perspective, I didn't pull up the reach for this, but it's I think close to 6 or 7 thousand listens per month. That's not a huge number, but it's also kind of within our sweet spot because if we look at some of the past guests that they've had on the podcast, we know that they are brand owners and operators and other agencies and owners and operators, other tool owners and operators. So reach won't be as necessary for us to really dive into because we feel so strongly about the content, the context, and the audience, right? So, and again, this is where CCAR is going to help us find the good fit shows. I would categorize this as a good fit, maybe not a best fit, again, because of that contextual call out with the potential request for remuneration. But if we were to now approach this from the 4A's framework, and again, looking at the 4A's, those are going to be actionable, analytical, anthropological, and aspirational. There might be some elements of each of them, but what I really like to do is first start by assessing their episode titles because that's going to help us wayfind in terms of which of the 4A's they're primarily looking at. So there's an existing episode, why most YouTube ads fail and how to make yours work. So that's, in my opinion, both actionable as well as anthropological. So actionable, how to make yours work. I mean, it doesn't get much more actionable than that. Anthropological, why did I put that? So why most YouTube ads fail? That is like this big question that's lurking out there for a lot of marketers. Like I see companies like Monday.com or Grammarly spending tons of money on YouTube advertising. I can't get through my favorite smooth jazz playlist without hearing a Grammarly ad interrupt the sweet, sweet sounds of Duke Ellington. But why does most of it fail, and why are those companies really standing out? So that's an anthropological reason, and it could be the creative, it could be the targeting, it could be the frequency, it could be the duration, it could be a whole host of things. But the promise that this episode has, anyway, is we know why it is. It's going to be to your benefit to listen to why YouTube ads fail. And we're going to take it a step further, and we're actually going to show you how to make sure that yours don't fail. Now, what's nice about this episode title specifically is it ties really, really well with what we know through the brief that we received from our client. One of the things that they want to tackle is the efficacy or effectiveness of podcast advertising. So, as we know through the State of Podcast Guest Pitching Report, which again we've referenced a couple of times, 63% of podcasts say the best pitches that they receive are ones that pitch an episode title or an episode concept. So if I'm thinking about that statistic, which is burned into my brain and hopefully is burned into yours too at this point, how would I pitch Pat as an episode concept, not Pat as an individual, but like what is the knowledge that he's going to share? What is the value he's going to bring to his audience? And how do I tie that back to the objectives of the campaign? And how do I tie that into some of the data that we've seen from the other content assets that have been provided by the client? This one is a really easy one-to-one for us. So if I were to rewrite this to pitch an episode concept to the direct-to-consumer podcast, why most podcast ads fail and how to make yours work. Easy peasy. They've already done my work for me. And now I know when I actually build out this pitch in and of itself, I need to come with reasons why podcast ads fail. And I know from having done a few podcast ad campaigns myself, targeting is a huge problem. Creative is a huge problem. Spend is a huge problem. Most people aren't spending enough as they start to experiment with the channel. So here, what I'll put in is some needs. So I need some step-by-step processes. I need some common mistakes. I need some solutions, and I need some evidentiary data. So because Pat has the luxury of being able to log into the self-serve platform and seeing which campaigns are performing versus which ones that are not, he can very quickly deduce through his team, his product marketing manager. These are our clients that are rebooking, and they're rebooking because they're seeing results. The clients that are setting up a campaign the first time and then never coming back, it's because they have poor results. Well, what's common of those clients that are having poor results? And again, oftentimes it's going to be targeting. They went too narrow with the audience. They went too broad with the content, these types of things. So now all of a sudden, just using one episode title, I can frame this into an episode that's going to deliver serious value for the podcast audience. So the next one we'll take a look at is going to be another episode that we pulled from Direct to Consumer, but how D2C brands are scaling with AppLovin, a guide to mobile ad success. So this is going to be both actionable as well as analytical. So how D2C brands are scaling with AppLovin. I'm going to put that in the analytical bucket. So it's very difficult to talk about scaling without having some sort of data to prove it, right? And then actionable, a guide to mobile ad success. So if you're presenting a guide or some sort of resource or some sort of a tangible, fungible type of thing, that's going to be very much an actionable lens to look this through. So again, as we put this through the episode concept filter, how D2C brands are scaling with podcast ads, a guide to audio success. That's very, very simple. It's probably table stakes. They might have had a different vendor pitching them that same sort of episode concept, but the point of doing this is to build that muscle in providing episode title ideas or episode concept ideas, because we know that most podcasts want to be pitched episode ideas because it's going to take a lot of the legwork out from the production team as well as the host. And again, from the needs perspective, we want a step-by-step process. We want case studies. We want data reports. So my assumption for this would be if you're going to say how D2C brands are scaling with AppLovin, you're not just going to make a broad-based claim and then reference information you pulled out of a chat GPT to say that. You can really only make this claim, how D2C brands are scaling with AppLovin, if you have a case study or if you have direct client experience, real client experience, and how that's actually working. So in this case, I would definitely want to pull through a case study. Do we have a case study? As a matter of fact, we do. We have the performance marketing playbook for podcast advertising, strategy formats, and ROI. So I could just use this piece of content to pitch, to really support the pitch by tying it directly back to exactly what we want to accomplish with this campaign in and of itself. So I'll do one more here. And this is a different podcast. This will be Do This, Not That. The existing episode is How to Stay in the Inbox with guest Michael Barber, CMO of StarTech.com and top email expert in the US. So this is both going to be actionable and anthropological. So how to stay in the inbox with guest Michael Barber. So actionable, how to, it's always going to reference us to actionable. And then anthropological, Um, Michael Barber, CMO of StarTech and top email expert in the US. I'm making a little bit of a logical jump here on the anthropological end. My assumption is going to be that because he's a CMO of a company and he's a top email expert in the US, he will have war stories from his time in the trenches about, why people aren't being in the inbox, and he's going to bring some of that information to the forefront as well. So again, if I were to rewrite this in the episode, frame, I would say how to start running podcast ad campaigns with guest Pat Butkus, SVP of Growth at Acast. And then Pat's also won a 40 under 40 award. So if that was enticing enough to include top email expert in a previous episode, well, Pat's won a 40 under 40 award. I think it was through Ad Age or Ad Large, one of them. And then we can insert that there as well. So again, what do I need? I need to find a step-by-step process. Where can I find step-by-step processes? I can do that by the Acast Ads Academy. I can pull what I learned out of the Acast Ads Academy and then put that into the pitch itself. Maybe even offer the Acast Ads Academy as the CTA at the end of the episode too. So again, I don't want to belabor this point of it too much longer, but when it comes to aligning the four A's with our guests, it's really, really helpful to think outside of just the corporate bio, the corporate CV. Let's look at the content ecosystem that currently exists. How can we leverage that? How can we use it? Obviously, Pat is going to be privy to all of this. He's played a major role in the creation of all of these documents and reports, and he should be able to speak at length about them because he has that firsthand experience as well. So again, I will make sure that you guys do get access to this, but the formula is fairly simple. Look at existing episode titles. In the last webinar, we looked at Dave Gerhardt's podcast, which is also a marketing podcast. And in the episode or in the podcast description, it talked about it's a tactical place for B2B marketers to learn, to grow, etc. And then when we looked at his last 7 episode titles, 6 of the 7 episode titles started with how to. So again, if we're thinking like this, how to should immediately raise the flag that how to is going to be an actionable type of podcast and interview. And if I'm going to have a podcast interview that is going to be primarily focusing on actionable, I need to make sure the pitch clearly lays out these are the action steps that your audience is going to leave with and how they're going to be enriched by the end of the interview as well. So cool. Um, awesome. So, a couple things. Like, if you don't get this level of detail in a campaign brief, I would highly suggest building a campaign brief like this. If you don't know what your client's goals are, it's going to be hard to even build a target account or a target hit list. If you don't have supporting documentation, such as these reports, like the playbooks that we talked about, or the third party things that we talked about, like we saw with the Podscribe example, this is really where I would start. And then as you're going through show selection again, um, I would look at it from 2 different perspectives, right? First is going to be using exact phrase match searches to find podcasts that are talking about either the content, so if we're starting content, or the audience. So we looked at the difference between performance marketers and performance marketing. And actually, I was going to show this real quick just to uh, kind of hammer home this point with CCAR. So if we look at performance marketing and we go into, come on, baby. Let's try one more time. Performance marketing. The screen might be frozen. If we go into one of these shows, it's the blessing and the curse of doing it live. Um, if we also want to know the density with which they've talked about a certain topic previously, we can do that within Podchaser Pro as well. So we'll pop into this one. This is going to be performance marketing unlocked. We look at the about this podcast that gets beneath the surface of the biggest issues in performance marketing, from TikTok and ChatGPT to the metaverse and PPC. In each episode, the editorial team interviews top marketers from brands, agencies, trade bodies, and platforms. Well, again, if we're thinking about Pat's campaign, Pat's a top marketer from a platform. Check. We can cross that off the list. This podcast gets beneath the surface of the biggest issues in performance marketing. Okay, so again, we've already gone through this with the exercise, but what are some of the biggest issues with podcast advertising? People have preconceptions about it. They have misnomers. They've heard it doesn't work. They've heard it works really well. They so on and so forth. Now we're starting to think about that from our 4A's lens as well as content, context, audience, and reach. But why I wanted to pull this up was to see the density with which they've already talked about podcast advertising. And this is something that's going to be a little bit difficult to always nail again because we don't have any control of the production cycle. But if their last 5 episodes were talking about podcast advertising or audio advertising or any of those types of things, maybe they're not ready to have another podcast advertiser or somebody who is promoting podcast advertising come onto the platform, onto their podcast. So if we actually pop into the episode side, I'm going to go into this. I apologize. I'm running on an i5 Intel chip on my 2018 MacBook Air. So that's why this is a little bit slow. But when I go into episodes and I search for, I'm not going to put in podcast because it's going to return a lot of results of the actual show itself. But let's look at audio as a keyword. Don't fail me now, i5. What we'll be able to see, and I've actually already done this before, but the last time they talked about audio advertising was with the head of ad revenue for Spotify for the UK, Ireland, and Europe. And that episode, oops, helps if I spell it right. That episode was in 2024. So here we are in 2026. Here we go. Spotify reveals how audio ads can drive performance. Is audio advertising a viable performance marketing channel? Millions of Brits listening to music and podcasts every day. So we can see, yeah, the head of sales for the UK and Northern Europe at Spotify. And we can see that this episode aired September 3rd, 2024. And then we see that there is another hit. Not going to be relevant for us, but the last time they talked about audio advertising or podcast advertising was September 2024. So I have zero issues, zero qualms about how Pat would stack rank with other content that they're talking about that's similar or related to what he wants to promote, which of course is the Acast self-serve platform, which is going to be to the benefit of brands, performance marketers, so on and so forth. So again, these are a couple of different things you can do to really drill into content, context, audience, and reach even further. Started with an exact phrase match search. Once you get a hit on a podcast or an episode, drill even further to see the density with which they've discussed that topic. Sometimes a fresh take on an existing topic can play really, really well, especially in light of new data. How do we have light on new data? Well, we could obviously pull something forward such as this. So again, this is kind of an inside view of how I think about all of these things. These are the exact processes that we put in place when we were doing this for booking 80 clients per month as guests on podcasts. One question that I'm always going to get, and I'm sure when I pull up the chat and that it's going to come up, is this takes a lot more time. And yeah, it does. It certainly does. And that's where I think when we start to view earned media placements more as craftsmanship as opposed to mass distribution, that's where the magic happens. So, again, hopefully this was helpful. I know we've got a couple minutes left, so let me pull up the chat and see where we're at. John, Transport Vintage Mac. Yeah, nailed it, buddy. Q&A. Let's see what we got here. How should we think about equivalent media value of a guest appearance versus an advertisement? That's a great question. So I would look at episode reach as the first and foremost, right? And episode reach, of course, you can see within the Podchaser Pro platform. And that would be the first thing I would look at. Second is going to be the amplification of that content after it gets published on social media. Almost all podcasts are doing something to distribute their content wider, typically through social media, but also oftentimes through newsletters as well. We have started to add newsletter links when we find them for podcasts. So oftentimes a podcast will have a companion newsletter. Within that newsletter, they're promoting their recent episode. You can obviously go to that newsletter and then see where your client was mentioned. You could ask for circulation. We don't have any reach metrics for newsletters quite yet, but we obviously have many of the social profiles that are associated with a podcast as well. So what I would do is start to aggregate a lot of those data points and then throw them into all of that, and that's going to be helpful from the EMV perspective. But we have 1 minute left, and folks are starting to get back to their regular day to day. But any other questions or comments within this? Again, we'll get the recording out early next week. Anybody else? All right, cool. By all means, if you have any further questions, comments, concerns, reach out to me, Trent at podchaser.com. If you are a Podchaser Pro customer, reach out to your client success manager, Sydney, John, or Jules. And hopefully this was helpful. We'll get the recording out next week. Thanks, everybody, for your time and attention.